And now we arrive at the part of the project filled with dread. Painting the raised lettering. Mess this up, and all of the hours spent making the machine shine will count for nothing. I didn't invent the technique I'm about to show, but I haven't seen it bouncing around elsewhere on YouTube. There are, however, plenty of examples of people attempting to paint raised lettering using what I would call difficult techniques. So, I advocate dabbing. There are two critical elements for the dabbing approach: the paint and the dabber. Let's start with the dabber. I hunt through my pile for the best rag. Most fabrics have an obvious ribbed pattern, and you want to pick one with a finer weave. I roll up the rag tightly and then secure it with a couple of cable ties. Next, I fold the rag in half. This further tightens everything up. You should end up with a really firm dabber. The second important element is the paint. I recommend water-based paint so that you can easily clean up rough areas or a mistake simply by wiping it with a damp rag or cotton bud. If you choose to use a solvent-based paint, you'll have to wipe off any blemishes with solvent, which will most likely ruin the underlying grey paint. The paint I'm using is just some leftover bright red water-based exterior paint, like you'd use to paint a fence or a fire station. I actually have it left over from painting birdhouses. The technique is pretty straightforward. I find it best to dab as vertically as possible for the first couple of coats. Lint and a rag will leave small streaks down the sides of the letters, and I use a combination of wet rag and toothpicks to clean the edges when necessary. It's pretty easy. By the third or fourth coat, you'll have a pretty good feel for the technique and can accurately apply pressure to spread the paint just right. The end result is only going to look as good as the casting is accurate. I don't try to get perfect letters. First, I have to deal with a pin and a hole. At the moment they are one. This pin and collar arrangement is common in British machinery of the era. I doubt the Myford has enough power to mangle the pin by itself, so I presume someone, for some reason, has decided to grind it down. Now, I don't have a Myford part number B20 pin handy, but I do have a bunch of Chinesium drill bits, and I'm sure one of them will be the right size. The bull gear has a small sliding tooth. This engages with the bronze gear on the inside of the pulley. During normal operation, this is engaged, meaning that the pulley and bull gear are locked together. Sometimes old woodruff keys can be a little sticky and need to be lightly rocked back and forth to seat properly. By now you've probably noticed that the bull gear is pretty damaged, so is the back gear. I'm not doing anything about it right now, just because I'll probably never use the back gear, and fixing the broken teeth will be a good little project when I'm equipped to cut gears. Quick tip, don't do what I've just done, forgetting to put the oil nipple on before assembling the pulley onto the spindle. This piece here is a threaded collar. This is the mechanism used to tighten the spindle laterally. The collar is locked by a small grub screw. Note that it is different from every other screw on the lathe in that it has a small flat end. This presses onto a tiny piece of copper, which is really easy to miss during disassembly. Not a big deal to replace it, of course, but may as well avoid the hassle. And the last piece of the spindle puzzle is the end gear. It's a wee bit painful because it is secured by a grub screw, half threaded into the gear and half threaded into the spindle. Of course, Myford would have drilled and tapped this in place, but we have to press the gear on while aligning the threads. It's a light press fit, so you can't wiggle things into place once it's on. It took me a couple of attempts to get the gear aligned properly, but no big deal. This is one of the original oilers. I intended to restore the oilers. I thought they'd make a great little project and an excuse to run through the DIY nickel electroplating process. I think these would have originally been nickel plated. But the problem is plastic. There aren't many plastic pieces on an ML7. Unfortunately, both oilers are cracked. You can see where someone has attempted a glue up in the past. I can't really fix fragile clear plastic. So I ordered a pair of new oilers from Myford. The price was not too bad, the quality seems okay, but cheapened compared to the originals. If anyone out there is sitting on a couple of original oilers that they don't need, with good plastic, get in touch. The ML7s use old-fashioned Babbitt bearings. Babbitt is a lead and tin-based alloy, sometimes called white metal, though that term normally applies to more modern applications like the linings on modern automotive bearings. And here is the back gear. The back gear is engaged and disengaged on a pretty simple cam mechanism. When in use, the larger gear runs on the pulley and the smaller gear runs on the bull gear. So instead of the pulley driving the bull gear directly, and therefore the spindle, the pulley instead drives the bull gear via the back gear, which simply reduces the speed of the lathe. Now it's time to install the bearing caps. The two halves of the Babbitt bearings don't quite make a full circle. Adjusting the gap between the two halves is how the pressure on the bearings is adjusted. The adjustment mechanism is shims. Shims are placed between the headstock and the bearing caps to force the gap to remain. I tightened the caps down with no shims first, just to the point that the spindle tightened, and roughly checked the gaps with a feeler gauge. I cut my own shims from brass shim sheet. What I'm aiming for here is for the bearings to be tight, while still allowing free movement. I can always tighten them more later, so I erred on the side of free movement so as not to risk damaging the bearings. And the last part of the assembly. We have to install the levers and plungers for the back gear and tumbler gears. Now to install the two tumbler gears. Note that the two gears are different sizes. I think one is 18 tooth and one 20. I checked the parts manual. The gear nearest the front of the lathe is the smaller of the two. When the plunger is in the centre hole, the tumbler gears are disconnected from the spindle, which is neutral. The lead screw doesn't turn. When in the forwards or downwards position, the larger of the two tumbler gears makes contact with both the end of the spindle and the gear train below. In reverse, the smaller of the two gears contacts the spindle and the larger of the two gears contacts the gear train below, so both tumbler gears are in use. And the extra gear, of course, reverses the drive through to the lead screw. And lastly, installing the back gear lever. I place a rag underneath the headstock to press upwards on the back gear, which is the engaged position, so that when the lever is installed it will be in the correct relationship. And here is what happens when the back gear is engaged but the small locking tooth on the bull gear isn't released. The spindle locks up. And this is why so many bull gears and back gears are damaged. People use the back gear as a lock to help remove stuck chucks.